before the stars and stripes waved in the wind, before the Declaration rang through Philadelphia, before Jamestown, before Plymouth, even before the word America meant anything to the world, there was a land. A vast, untamed, richly storied land. It breathed under endless forests, ancient mountains, and wild rivers. For over 15,000 years, people lived here not just surviving, but thriving, innovating, trading, building empires long before the Founding Fathers ever took pen to parchment. This is not just the story of a country. This is the odyssey of a civilization carved in fire, freedom, blood, and bold ambition. The United States of America did not rise overnight. It emerged from the clash of cultures, the fall of kingdoms, and the hope of millions who dared to imagine a new world. We will trace this journey across 25 epic chapters from the ancient, mound-building civilizations of Cahokia to the revolutionary cries that gave birth to a republic. Through civil wars and civil rights, industrial booms and digital awakenings, from manifest destiny to moral reckoning, from slave ships to the moon landing, from 13 colonies to 50 United States, this is the long, hard road of a nation always becoming. It is a story of contradiction. Liberty and slavery, equality and exclusion, patriotism and protest. It is a story still being written today in the marches of citizens, the chambers of Congress, and the dreams of children from every background. So buckle in. Whether you're a student of history or a curious mind searching for truth, prepare to travel across centuries of triumph, tragedy, and transformation. This is not just the past. It is the living soul of a nation. This is the entire history of the United States of America, from the ancient to the modern. Long before the ink dried on the U.S. Constitution or Columbus sailed the ocean blue, the land that would become the United States was home to advanced and diverse indigenous cultures. The story begins at the end of the last ice age, when Paleo-Indians first crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into what is now Alaska, around 13,000 to 15,000 years ago, were the first Americans hunter-gatherers, later forming complex societies across the continent. One of the earliest and most sophisticated of these civilizations was the Clovis culture, identifiable by their distinct stone tools. As centuries passed, populations spread and diversified, adapting to the landscapes from the Great Plains to the Mississippi River Valley to the Pacific Coast. Among the most striking ancient cultures was the Mississippian civilization, which thrived from around 800 to 1600 CE. Their central city, Cahokia, located near present-day St. Louis, once housed more than 20,000 people, more than London at the time. Cahokia featured immense earthen mounds, complex social hierarchies, and a trading network that reached across the continent. To the southwest, the ancestral Pueblans, often called the Anasazi, built cliffside dwellings and intricate irrigation systems in places like Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. Their adobe cities rose in defiance of the desert, reflecting astronomical precision and engineering prowess. In the Pacific Northwest, indigenous nations like the Haida and Tlingit developed seafaring cultures rooted in fishing, whaling, and cedar craftsmanship. Along the eastern seaboard, Algonquian and Iroquoian tribes built thriving confederacies. Notably the Iroquois League, whose democratic model would later influence European political thinkers. These peoples were not static. They adapted to climate change, engaged in warfare and diplomacy, and developed religions, oral traditions, and complex governance. They were scientists, architects, astronomers, and warriors. By the time Europeans arrived, an estimated 5 to 10 million indigenous people lived in North America, organized, knew over 500 distinct tribes and nations. Their societies were as rich and varied as those in Europe, Africa, or Asia. Yet much of this ancient heritage would soon be overshadowed. Disease, displacement, and conquest loomed on the horizon. But to understand America, we must honor its first chapters penned in obsidian, woven in deerskin, and sung around sacred fires. The story of the United States does not begin with its founding fathers. It begins with the first peoples, who shaped this land in ways still visible today. The arrival of Europeans on American shores was not a gentle beginning. It was a collision of worlds, of empires, of destinies. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, landed in the Caribbean, believing he'd reached Asia. Though he never set foot in what is now the U.S., his voyage opened the floodgates. Soon, European powers, Spain, France, England, Portugal, the Netherlands, raced to explore, conquer, and colonize the New World. The Spanish were first to stake a claim. Juan Ponce explored Florida in 1513. By 1565, St. Augustine, founded by Pedro de, became the first permanent European settlement in what would become the United States. Meanwhile, Spanish missionaries moved into the Southwest, establishing missions in places like Santa Fe and San Antonio. To the north, French explorers like Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain navigated the St. Lawrence River and Great Lakes, establishing the fur trade and alliances with indigenous nations. French trappers ventured deep into the interior, forging ties and sometimes conflict with native peoples. But it was the English, arriving later, who would leave the most lasting imprint. In 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh's ill-fated Roanoke colony vanished without a trace, the lost colony etched into history. But in 1607, the English returned, founding Jamestown, Virginia. The first enduring English settlement, life was brutal. Starvation, disease, and indigenous resistance nearly wiped the colony out. Yet it survived, and its survival set the course for the next 400 years. The consequences of European contact were devastating for Native Americans. Diseases like smallpox decimated populations. Entire nations disappeared within decades. Colonization upended indigenous lifeways, seized lands, and sparked centuries of resistance and tragedy. Yet even amidst this chaos, cultural exchanges occurred. Corn, tomatoes, potatoes, and tobacco changed diets and economies in Europe. Horses, steel tools, and firearms transformed life for many native peoples. The age of exploration was a time of curiosity and conquest, of greed and glory, of discovery and devastation. It would set the stage for colonial rivalries, revolution, and the birth of a new nation. The map was changing. And so was the world. With the survival of Jamestown, England had secured its first foothold in North America. Over the next century and a half, that single, struggling outpost would evolve into 13 distinctive colonies, each with its own identity, economy, and culture, but increasingly bound by a shared destiny. The growth of the English colonies was not uniform. Virginia, named for the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I, grew wealthy on tobacco thanks, in part to enslaved labor. Further north, the New England colonies Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire were shaped by Puritan values, founded by religious dissenters seeking a city upon a hill. These communities prioritized church, education, and strict moral codes. The founding of Plymouth in 1620 by the Pilgrims, followed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, set a precedent for democratic governance with documents like the Mayflower Compact. To the middle, colonies like New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania were far more diverse. New York, once New Amsterdam, had been taken from the Dutch. Pennsylvania was a haven for Quakers under William Penn, preaching tolerance and equality. These middle colonies became melting pots of languages, religions, and commerce. In the South, Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia formed plantation societies. Cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo created an agrarian, elite-fueled, a brutal system of racialized slavery, the arrival of enslaved Africans, first in Virginia. In 1619 would grow into the foundation of a transatlantic slave economy that shaped every aspect of colonial life. Life in the colonies was often harsh. Disease, conflict with native tribes, and political instability were constant. The Pequot War, King Philip's War, and Bacon's Rebellion revealed deep tensions over land, power, and identity. Yet the colonies matured. They built legislative assemblies, enforced local laws, and began to see themselves as something new, not just transplanted Englishmen, but Americans. Trade flourished through triangular routes connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Colonial ports like Boston, Charleston, and Philadelphia became bustling centers of commerce. Education advanced. Harvard was founded in 1636. Ideas of liberty and natural rights began to spread, planted in sermons, pamphlets, and colonial charters. But by the mid-1700s, the colonies were not merely growing. They were chafing. Royal governors clashed with local assemblies. Britain's mercantilist policies imposed restrictions. And looming in the shadows were rival empires France and Spain's threatening war. The colonies had become a complex society, rich in contradiction and promise. 13 distinct stories woven into one tapestry. And the seeds of revolution were beginning to sprout. The mid-18th century marked a turning point. The American colonies, though growing in strength and population, were still chess pieces in a much larger game. The global struggle between European empires. That game turned violent in 1754, igniting the French and Indian War known globally as the 7 Years' War. This was not merely a colonial squabble. It was a worldwide conflict between Britain and France, fought on 5 continents. But in North America, it was about territory and supremacy. The spark came in the Ohio River Valley. The French, fearing British expansion, built a chain of forts to protect their claims. The British responded with military force. A young and ambitious George Washington, just 22 years old, led an expedition to confront the French at Fort Duquesne. The result? Skirmish? A massacre? And the war's first shots fired by Washington himself. What followed was a brutal, bloody conflict between the British and their American colonists, and the French and their native allies. The war saw the use of frontier militias, scorched earth campaigns, and shifting alliances. The native nations, particularly the Iroquois Confederacy, Shawnee, and Algonquins, fought to defend their lands, often siding with the French, who they saw as lesser evils. Key battles at Fort William Henry, Fort Ticonderoga, and Quebec eventually turned the tide. With the 1763 Treaty of Paris, Britain emerged victorious. France ceded nearly all its North American territory, leaving Britain with dominion over Canada, the Ohio Valley, and the Mississippi Basin. But victory brought a heavy cost. Britain was now deeply in debt. Maintaining troops and managing new territories demanded revenue. Parliament looked to the colonies to pay their fair share through taxes and laws. Yet the colonists, proud of their contributions to the war effort, expected gratitude, not punishment. Even more, Native American tribes, now left to face an unchecked British presence, rose up in resistance. Pontiac's Rebellion of 1763 saw a confederation of tribes attack British forts across the frontier. In response, Britain issued the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlement west of the Appalachians, a move that infuriated land-hungry colonists. The war had united the colonies briefly. It had given rise to shared sacrifice and emerging leaders. But it also sowed deep resentment, imperial overreach, taxation without representation, and military occupation. The French and Indian War ended the era of benign neglect. A new era was dawning, one of protests, rebellion, and revolution. The ink on the Treaty of Paris had barely dried when a new battle began, not with muskets and cannon, but with taxes, protests, and ideology. The American colonies, once loyal subjects of the British Crown, were awakening to a new and dangerous idea, that liberty might require rebellion. The Proclamation of 1763, issued to prevent colonists from settling west of the Appalachians, was deeply resented. Colonists saw the fertile Ohio Valley as their right, earned through blood in the French and Indian War. The Crown saw only the risk of further native conflict and a mounting bill to pay. To manage its imperial burden, Britain turned to taxation. In 1765 came the Stamp Act, a direct tax on printed materials, newspapers, licenses, even playing cards. The backlash was immediate. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry. The Sons of Liberty, led by men like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry, organized fiery protests. Colonial newspapers fanned the flames. Effigies of tax collectors hung in the streets. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act a year later, but followed it with the Declaratory Act, affirming Britain's right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. More taxes followed. The Townshend Acts imposed duties on glass, tea, and paper. Colonists responded with boycotts, petitions, and speeches. British troops were sent to enforce the law, especially in Boston, a city now boiling with tension. That tension exploded on March 5, 1770, when British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists, killing 5. The Boston Massacre, as it came to be known, became a symbol of tyranny. Paul Revere's engraving of the event was propaganda at its most powerful. Though most townshend duties were repealed, one remained. The tax on tea, 1773. Parliament granted the East India Company the right to sell tea directly to the colonies, undercutting local merchants. The result? On December 16th, Boston patriots, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party was defiant, theatrical, and revolutionary. Britain responded with fury. The coercive acts closed Boston's port, altered Massachusetts' charter, and allowed British officials to be tried in Britain. In response, colonial leaders convened the First Continental Congress in 1774, urging unity, resistance, and the formation of militias. By early 1775, the powder keg was set. Lexington and Concord lay just over the horizon. The colonies had not yet declared independence. Many still hoped for reconciliation. But the path was set. A confrontation with the British Empire was not just likely, it was inevitable. It began with a shot fired in the morning, missed a shot that echoed around the world. On April 19, 1775, British troops marched from Boston to seize weapons in Concord, Massachusetts. They were met at Lexington Green by colonial militia, who fired first, remains unknown. But when the smoke cleared, 8 Americans lay dead. Hours later, at Concord's North Bridge, the Minutemen fired back. The British retreated under a hail of musket fire. The American Revolution had begun. The colonial response was swift. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia and appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Militias laid siege to Boston. The bloody Battle of Bunker Hill proved that the colonists would fight fiercely even if the British held the field. In July 1776, after months of debate, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, penned primarily by Thomas Jefferson. It was a bold statement. All men are created equal, it claimed. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. With its adoption, 13 colonies became a new nation, the United States of America. But independence was far from secure. The British launched a full-scale war. They captured New York City in 1776. Washington's forces were driven across New Jersey. Morale was low. But on Christmas night, Washington crossed the icy Delaware River, striking a surprise victory at Trenton. A week later, he triumphed again at Princeton. In 1777, American forces under Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold defeated a British army at Saratoga, turning point, that persuaded France to formally join the war. Spain and the Dutch Republic followed, turning a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. Yet the war dragged on. Harsh winters, especially at Valley Forge, tested the resolve of Washington's troops. In the South, brutal fighting erupted as Loyalists and Patriots clashed in civil war-like violence. The endgame came in 1781. British General Cornwallis, attempting to link up with Royal Navy support, entrenched his army at Yorktown, Virginia. Washington, along with French General Rochambeau and Admiral de Grasse, surrounded and besieged the town. After weeks of bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered on October 19, 1781. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris recognized American independence and ceded British territory from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. The United States of America was now a sovereign nation. The revolution was not just a war of muskets, it was a revolution of ideas, created a republic unlike any seen before. But questions of slavery, native land, and women's rights remained unanswered. The promise of liberty had been declared but not yet fulfilled. The war was over, but peace brought its own challenges. The young United States had won its independence, but not yet its identity. 13 sovereign states were loosely bound under the Articles of Confederation, a framework designed to avoid centralized power. Yet this early system was fragile. There was no executive branch, no federal judiciary, and Congress lacked the power to tax or regulate trade. Unity was more ideal than reality. The post-war years were turbulent. Economic depression hit hard. States printed worthless currency. Veterans went unpaid. Conflicts flared between states. Most alarmingly, in 1786, a group of armed farmers in western Massachusetts, led by Daniel Chassereau's, in rebellion over debts and taxes. Chasse's rebellion exposed the weakness of the Confederation government. Something had to change. In May 1787, delegates from 12 states met in Philadelphia to revise the Articles. What followed was nothing less than a constitutional revolution. So over 4 intense months, men like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Benjamin Franklin crafted a new system of government anchored by checks and balances, a bicameral legislature, and a powerful but limited executive. The Constitution of the United States, signed on September 17, 1787, proposed a republic guided by law and representation. Yet ratification was not guaranteed. Debate raged between Federalists, who supported the Constitution, and Anti-Federalists, who feared centralized tyranny. The Federalist Papers, written by Madison Hamilton and John Jay, argued for the document's merits. Ultimately, compromise prevailed with the promise of a Bill of Rights. Ratified in 1791, guaranteeing freedoms like speech, religion, and due process. In 1789, George Washington became the nation's first president. Revered for his leadership and restraint, he set vital precedents, serving only 2 terms, forming a cabinet, and insisting the presidency remain above party politics. Yet, political factions soon formed. Hamilton's Federalists favored a strong national government, industrial development, and close ties with Britain. Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans championed agrarianism, states' rights, and support for revolutionary France. The 1790s were a decade of firsts: the first national bank, first foreign entanglements, the first Supreme Court rulings, and the first bitter partisan disputes. The Whiskey Rebellion in 1794 tested federal authority. Washington's firm response affirmed its legitimacy. Washington's farewell address warned against factionalism and foreign alliances, warnings largely ignored. In 1796, John Adams became the second president, narrowly defeating Jefferson. His presidency, marred by the Alien and Sedition Acts, revealed how fragile liberty could be even under a Democratic flag. Still, the foundation was laid. The Constitution endured. The American experiment, flawed but full of promise, had begun. The election of 1800 marked the first peaceful transfer of power in American history, a remarkable moment in a world still dominated by monarchs. Thomas Jefferson, philosopher, statesman, and author of the Declaration of Independence, now led the nation. He called it a revolution, not of weapons, but of principles. Jefferson's vision was of a yeoman republic, a nation of independent farmers, free from urban corruption and foreign entanglement. His presidency would challenge that ideal in both triumph and contradiction. In 1803, Jefferson authorized the Louisiana Purchase, acquiring over 800,000 square miles from France for $15 million, doubling the size of the United States. It was a constitutional gamble, but the opportunity was too great. The land stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rockies. It was vast, fertile land inhabited by dozens of native nations. To explore it, Jefferson commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, whose expedition, guided in part by the Shoshone woman Sacagawea, mapped the new territory and opened paths to the Pacific. Yet expansion deepened contradictions. Slavery expanded into new lands. Native Americans were further displaced. Jefferson's ideals of liberty coexisted uneasily with the institution of bondage. Meanwhile, foreign policy posed new trials. American merchant ships faced harassment by British and French navies, both locked in Napoleonic War. The British practice of impressment, seizing American sailors into Royal Navy service, outraged the public. Jefferson's response, the Embargo Act of 1807, aimed to punish Britain and France by cutting off trade. Instead, it devastated the U.S. economy and stirred deep opposition. In 1809, James Madison became president. Diplomatic efforts failed to halt British aggression. Warhawks in Congress, led by Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, demanded action. In 1812, the U.S. declared war on Britain. The War of 1812 was chaotic. U.S. forces failed to conquer Canada and saw Washington, D.C. burned in 1814, but key victories including Oliver Hazard Perry's triumph on Lake Erie and Andrew Jackson's decisive win at the Battle of New Orleans galvanized American pride. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in December 1814, ended the war with no territorial changes. But in its wake, a surge of nationalism swept the country. Americans began to see themselves not as former colonies, but as a unified people. The Jeffersonian era expanded the nation and tested its ideals. It revealed both the potential and peril of a republic growing fast and unsure of its place in the world. The War of 1812 had ended in what many called a drawbutt to Americans, especially after the resounding victory at New Orleans. It felt like a second war of independence. In the aftermath, a rare spirit of national unity took hold. This was the so-called era of good feelings, a time marked by political harmony, growing economic strength, and a rising sense of American identity. James Monroe, elected president in 1816, presided over this calm. A veteran of the Revolution and protege of Jefferson, Monroe was the last of the Virginia dynasty. Under his leadership, party divisions seemed to fade. Federalist Party, weakened and discredited after opposing the War of 1812, all but disappeared. For a brief moment, it appeared that the country could move forward as one. Yet beneath the surface, powerful tensions remained. Economically, America was transforming. The market revolution was taking shape, powered by canals, steamboats, and early factories. The Erie Canal, begun in 1817, would soon link the Great Lakes to the Atlantic. Its cities like Buffalo, Albany, and New York flourished. Cotton cultivation exploded in the South, feeding northern mills and expanding slavery into the Deep South. To support growth, Congress passed the American System, championed by Henry Clay, a vision of protective tariffs, a rechartered Bank of the United States, and federally funded internal improvements. It was ambitious and controversial. While it spurred development, it also intensified sectional divides. Monroe's era also brought bold diplomatic and territorial advances. In Ibagué, the Adams Treaty secured Florida from Spain. The Rush-Bagot Agreement demilitarized the U.S.-Canada border. And in 1823, Monroe issued a statement that would shape hemispheric policy for generations. The Monroe Doctrine. It warned European powers against further colonization in the Americas, asserting the Western Hemisphere as a U.S. sphere of influence. Yet the most critical event of the period was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. When Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state, it threatened to upset the balance of power between free and slave states in the Senate. The compromise, engineered by Clay, admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. While banning slavery north of the 3,630 parallel in the Louisiana Territory, the compromise maintained peace, but only temporarily. It revealed how deeply sectional interests had begun to take root. As Monroe's presidency ended, new voices rose. The next election would be fiercely contested. The era of good feelings would give way to the era of mass politics, fierce partisanship, and profound transformation. The election of 1824 shattered the illusion of national unity. For candidates Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Henry Clay all ran as Democratic Republicans. Jackson won the most popular and electoral votes, but not a majority. The House of Representatives chose Adams after Clay, Speaker of the House, threw his support behind him. Jackson's supporters called it a corrupt bargain. Adams' presidency was marked by visionary plans for national infrastructure and education, but he faced relentless opposition from Jacksonians. The country was moving toward a new kind of politics, more democratic, more populist, and more divided. In 1828, Andrew Jackson won the presidency in a landslide. A war hero, frontiersman, and symbol of the common man, Jackson reshaped American politics. He expanded suffrage, dismantled elitism, and introduced a spoils system that rewarded political loyalty. But Jackson's democracy was also defined by exclusion and aggression. His most infamous policy was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the forced relocation of native tribes from the Southeast. The Cherokee Nation, despite winning a Supreme Court case affirming their rights, were driven from their land. The Trail of Tears led to the deaths of thousands, an enduring scar on the American conscience. Jackson also clashed with the Bank of the United States, which he viewed as an instrument of elite control. His veto of its recharter in 1832 sparked the Bank War, which ultimately destabilized the economy. He removed federal deposits from the bank and placed them in pet banks, fueling speculation and inflation. His presidency also saw the emergence of the Democratic Party, rooted in Jacksonian ideals. In opposition, the Whig Party formed, uniting those who resisted Jackson's authoritarian style. Meanwhile, tensions over tariffs and states' rights flared in the nullification crisis of 1832–33. South Carolina, led by John C. Calhoun, declared a federal tariff null and void. Jackson, despite being a Southerner and states' rights advocate, responded forcefully, threatening military action. Compromise, again by Henry Clay, averted secession. The 1830s were also a time of social reform and religious revival. The Second Great Awakening swept across the country, inspiring movements for temperance, women's rights, education, and the growing call to end slavery. Jackson's successors, including Martin Van Buren, struggled with economic collapse after the Panic of 1837. By 1840, Whig candidate William Henry Harrison won on a populist platform, only to die a month into office. The age of Jackson expanded political participation, but also deepened divides, marginalized Native peoples, and planted the seeds of future crisis. In the mid-19th century, Americans embraced an idea that would shape a generation and redraw the map of a continent. That idea was manifest destiny. The belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was part aspiration, part ideology, and entirely transformative. The slogan became national policy under President James K. Polk. Elected in 1844, a devoted expansionist, Polk promised to secure Oregon, Texas, and California, and he delivered. But the road to expansion was paved with ambition, conflict, and conquest. The annexation of Texas in 1845, which had seceded from Mexico nearly a decade earlier, ignited war. Mexico considered Texas still theirs, and tensions exploded in 1846. The Mexican-American War followed a controversial and bloody campaign. American forces, under generals like Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, pushed deep into Mexican territory. In 1847, U.S. troops captured Mexico City itself. The war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Mexico ceded vast territory, present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The Mexican cession fulfilled manifest destiny, but at great cost. Meanwhile, the Oregon Territory was peacefully acquired through diplomacy with Britain. By 1846, the 49th parallel was established as the northern border. Now, from sea to shining sea, the United States stretched across the continent. This rapid expansion had consequences. First, it reignited the debate over slavery. Would these new territories be free or slaveholding? The Wilmot Proviso, proposed in 1846 to ban slavery in the Mexican cession, failed, but exposed the deepening divide. Second, expansion displaced millions. Native American tribes were pushed further west or destroyed altogether. The dream of westward growth became a nightmare for many indigenous peoples. Third, it spurred migration. The California gold rush of 1849 drew hundreds of thousands westward. Boomtowns sprang up overnight. Railroads, wagon trains, and steamboats carried settlers. Trails like the Oregon, California, and Santa Fe became lifelines of movement and symbols of opportunity. But not all who came were welcomed. Chinese immigrants faced brutal discrimination. Free black Americans who moved west often found themselves barred from land or voting rights. The West offered promise but not equality. By 1854, manifest destiny had been largely fulfilled on the map, but it had broken political consensus. The United States was growing but also unraveling. The next battle wouldn't be over territory, it would be over the soul of the nation. By the 1850s, the United States had expanded across a continent, but its unity was crumbling. The core issue: slavery not just as a moral question, but as a political and economic fault line. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Authored by Stephen A. Douglas, it repealed the Missouri Compromise, allowing settlers in those territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery popular sovereignty. The result was chaos. In Bleeding Kansas, Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers poured into the territory, clashing violently. Towns were burned, ballots were rigged, and blood was spilled. Abolitionist John Brown, radicalized by the violence, launched attacks that would make him both hero and villain. The Kansas-Nebraska Act also shattered the national political system. The Whig Party collapsed. In its place rose a new coalition, the Republican Party. Founded in 1854 on a platform opposing the expansion of slavery, it drew in former Whigs, Free Soilers, and abolitionists. The country's politics were now sectional. Democrats strong in the South, Republicans rising in the North. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision sent shockwaves through the nation. The Supreme Court, under Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, ruled that African Americans free or enslaved could not be U.S. citizens, and that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories. It invalidated decades of compromise. For abolitionists, it was a judicial betrayal. For Southern leaders, it was a validation. Amidst this turmoil, voices grew louder and sharper. Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe spoke against slavery's cruelty. Southern leaders, in turn, hardened their defense, arguing slavery was not just a necessity but a moral good. In 1859, John Brown reappeared, this time at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He and a small group tried to spark a slave rebellion by seizing a federal armory. The uprising failed. Brown was captured, tried, and hanged. To the South, he was a terrorist. To many in the North, a martyr. The final blow came in 1860. Abraham Lincoln, an Illinois lawyer and Republican, was elected president. He vowed to stop the spread of slavery, but not to abolish it where it already existed. Still, Southern leaders saw his election as intolerable. Within weeks, South Carolina seceded. Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. By early 1861, the Confederate States of America had formed. The nation had split in two. War was not just coming, it was already here. The American Civil War began, not with a declaration, but with the thunder of cannon over Fort Sumter, South Carolina. On April 12, 1861, Southern guns fired on a federal garrison, forcing its surrender. President Abraham Lincoln responded by calling for 75,000 volunteers. The die was cast. 11 Southern states claiming to defend states' rights and the institution of slavery formed the Confederate States of America under Jefferson Davis. The North, the Union, fought to preserve the Republic. But as the war wore on, it would become a struggle over the very meaning of freedom. The Confederacy had the advantage of strong military leaders, home terrain, and fierce resolve. The Union had industry, manpower, railroads, and a growing navy. Early battles were brutal. At Bull Run, the North realized the war would not be quick. At Antietam, 23,000 men fell in a single day, the bloodiest in American history. Lincoln faced enormous pressure. Border states teetered between loyalty and secession. His generals, cautious and divided, often frustrated him, but he held firm. In 1863, after the Union's costly but decisive victory at Gettysburg, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory to be free. Though limited in immediate effect, the proclamation changed the war's purpose. It turned a battle to preserve the Union into a moral crusade. Enslaved people fled Southern plantations by the tens of thousands, joining Union lines. Black soldiers, many former slaves, joined the fight. Eventually, over 180,000 would serve in the Union Army and Navy. The war ground on. In the West, Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, splitting the Confederacy along the Mississippi. In the East, battles raged from Chancellorsville to Chickamauga. Desperation grew in the South. Civilians starved. Cities burned, yet the fighting continued. In 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to overall command. Grant waged a war of attrition, battering Confederate forces with relentless assaults. In the South, William Tecumseh, Sherman marched through Georgia, destroying infrastructure and morale in his devastating march to the sea. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The war was over. More than 620,000 Americans were dead. Cities lay in ruins. Families were torn apart. On April 14th, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer, while attending a play. The nation mourned. The man who had saved the Union would not live to rebuild it. But one thing was now clear. The Union, endured in slavery after centuries of cruelty, was no more. The Civil War had ended. The Union was preserved. Slavery was abolished. But what kind of nation would rise from the ashes? The answer lay in Reconstruction. Turbulent, hopeful. It's an ultimately tragic era that sought to remake the South and define the future of American democracy. Under President Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, Reconstruction began with leniency. Johnson, a Southern Unionist, issued sweeping pardons and allowed former Confederates to regain power. Southern legislatures, in turn, passed Black Codes laws designed to restrict the rights of freed African Americans and preserve white supremacy. Outraged, radical Republicans in Congress seized control. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment. Granting citizenship and equal protection to all born in the U.S., the South was divided into military districts. Former Confederates were disenfranchised. Freedmen voted on were elected to public office in record numbers. From 1867 to 1877, African Americans participated in democracy like never before. Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce served in the U.S. Senate. State legislatures, especially in South Carolina and Louisiana, saw multiracial coalitions govern. Schools, churches, and communities blossomed. The Freedmen's Bureau provided aid, education, and legal support. For a moment, the promise of equality felt real. But opposition grew fierce. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan waged a campaign of terror. Lynching, intimidation, and violence were tools of political suppression. Reconstruction governments were labeled corrupt. Northern support for federal enforcement began to wane. In 1872, Grant was re-elected, but beset by scandals. The economy faltered in the Panic of 1873. The Supreme Court chipped away at civil rights protections. Democrats regained power in southern states, promising redemption, a return to white control. The final blow came in the election of 1876. Disputed results in several states led to a political compromise. Rutherford B. Hayes would become president, but federal troops would be withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction was over. In its wake, a brutal regime of Jim Crow laws, disenfranchisement, and racial violence emerged. The dream of equality was deferred, but not forgotten. For millions of freed people, the struggle had only begun. Reconstruction was America's first great reckoning with its past and its future. It asked whether freedom could be truly shared. The answer, for the time being, was no. But seeds were planted that would rise again generations later in the long march towards civil rights. In the decades after Reconstruction, America transformed at breathtaking speed. The period known as the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain to suggest a glittering surface hiding deep corruption, was marked by astonishing economic growth, rapid urbanization, and wrenching social change. Fueled by the Second Industrial Revolution, the United States became the world's leading industrial power by 1900. Railroads crisscrossed the continent, linking cities, ports, and farms. Steel, oil, and electricity revolutionized infrastructure and commerce. Inventors like Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell changed how Americans lived and communicated. Entrepreneurs, often called robber barons by their critics, amassed fortunes. John D. Rockefeller in oil, Andrew Carnegie in steel, Cornelius Vanderbilt in railroads, and J.P. Morgan in finance. The rise of corporations created unimaginable wealth, but also profound inequality. While industrialists built mansions and monopolies, millions of workers toiled in factories for long hours and low pay. Child labor was common. Tenements swelled in cities like New York and Chicago, where immigrants crowded into neighborhoods filled with promise and peril. Immigration soared. From the 1880s onward, new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe arrived by the millions. Italians, Poles, Jews, Greeks, and others fleeing poverty, persecution, and conflict. Asian immigrants, especially the Chinese, came to the West Coast. Many worked on railroads or in mines, but faced harsh discrimination. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first major law restricting immigration by race or nationality. Political machines like New York's Tammany Hall traded services for votes, often enriching themselves. Corruption tainted city halls and Congress alike. But reformers pushed back. Civil Service Act of 1883 began to professionalize government jobs. Journalists known as muckrakers exposed abuses in tenements, meatpacking plants, and corporate boardrooms. Labor unrest simmered. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Haymarket Affair in 1886, and the Pullman Strike in 1894 showed the growing tension between capital and labor. Unions like the Knights of Labor, and later the American Federation of Labor, demanded fair wages, safe conditions, and shorter hours. In the South, Jim Crow laws tightened racial segregation. Plessy v. Ferguson upheld separate but equal, cementing legal apartheid for decades. Black Americans faced disenfranchisement, lynching, and exclusion. Yet leaders like Booker T. Washington and Ida B. Wells rose to challenge inequality with education and activism. The Gilded Age was dazzling and dangerous, an age of innovation and exploitation, of dreams realized and denied. Beneath the wealth and wonder, deep fractures formed waiting for reckoning. As the 19th century closed, America turned its gaze outward. Expansion no longer meant just westward. Now it meant beyond the continent to islands, oceans, and foreign markets. The era of American imperialism had begun. Several forces drove this shift. Industrial growth demanded new markets and raw materials. Naval theorists like Alfred Thayer Mahan argued that great nations required overseas bases and a powerful fleet. Politicians and business leaders embraced a vision of American greatness tied to expansion. Meanwhile, American missionaries and reformers believed it their duty to spread Christianity and civilization. Racist ideologies, especially social Darwinism, framed conquest as natural, even moral. The first major test came in the Caribbean. In Cuba, rebellion against Spanish rule erupted in the 1890s. Americans sympathized with the Cuban. Cozen's sensationalist journalism, or yellow journalism, inflamed passions with tales of Spanish atrocities. When the U.S. battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in 1898, killing 266 sailors, the cry was immediate. Remember the Maine? War fever swept the country. On April 25th, the U.S. declared war on Spain. The Spanish-American War was short but transformative. In less than 4 months, U.S. forces overwhelmed Spain and Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Future President Theodore Roosevelt became a national hero with his Rough Riders at the Battle of San Juan Hill. The Treaty of Paris ended the war. Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the U.S. Cuba became a U.S. protectorate. America had joined the ranks of global empires. But imperialism sparked fierce debate. Critics like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and the Anti-Imperialist League argued that empire betrayed American values of liberty and self-rule. It's the Philippine-American War. A brutal conflict sparked by Filipino resistance to U.S. occupation revealed the darker side of expansion, with thousands killed on both sides. In the Pacific, the U.S. annexed Hawaii in 1898, following the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani. It secured influence in China through the open door policy, asserting equal trading rights among foreign powers. At home, the imperial moment fed nationalism and Aussies. As the 20th century dawned, the U.S. stood taller on the world stage than ever before. But questions loomed. Would empire compromise democracy? Could liberty and conquest coexist? The answer, as the next century would reveal, was complex. America had arrived, but the consequences of its expansion were only beginning to unfold. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it a surge of reform, optimism, and moral reckoning. Known as the Progressive Era, this period was driven by a belief that government, guided by science, reason, and justice, could correct the excesses of the Gilded Age. It was a time of bold ideas and bold leaders. Theodore Roosevelt, who became president in 1901 after the assassination of William McKinley, embodied the progressive spirit, a reform-minded Republican. Roosevelt believed in a square deal for the American people, balancing the needs of labor, business, and consumers. He took on powerful monopolies, earning the title Trustbuster. Under his administration, the Sherman Antitrust Act was aggressively enforced. Roosevelt also championed conservation, expanded the national park system, protected millions of acres of forests and wildlife refuges, and established the U.S. Forest Service. Roosevelt. Preserving nature was both a moral duty and a patriotic one. Journalists, known as muckrakers, played a vital role in the era. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle exposed unsanitary conditions in meatpacking plants, prompting the Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act. Ida Tarbell's investigation into Standard Oil revealed corporate abuses. Jacob Riis and Lincoln Steffens brought attention to poverty and political corruption in cities. Progressivism reached far beyond the presidency. Cities saw the rise of settlement houses like Hull House, led by Jane Addams, which offered support to immigrants and the poor. Labor movements gained ground. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911, which killed 146 garment workers, led to major workplace reforms. Women were at the forefront. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Alice Paul fought tirelessly for suffrage. Temperance movements, led by the Women's Christian Temperance Union, pushed for prohibition. The 19th Amendment was not yet law, but the momentum was building. Under President William Howard Taft, reforms continued, though less dramatically. By 1912, Roosevelt, frustrated with Taft's conservatism, formed the Progressive Bull Moose Party, splitting the Republican vote, and allowing Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat and reformer in his own right, to win the presidency. Wilson expanded the regulatory state, creating the Federal Reserve System and Federal Trade Commission. He passed child labor laws and strengthened antitrust legislation with the Clayton Act. Yet, the progressive era had limits. Racial segregation remained entrenched. W.E.B. Du Bois and the newly formed NAACP fought for civil rights in the face of discrimination and violence. Wilson himself upheld racist policies, segregating the federal workforce. Despite these contradictions, the progressives reshaped America, proving that reform could be driven not by revolution, but by civic activism, legislation, and the power of the people. But soon domestic reform would give way to global conflict. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, the United States initially stayed out. President Woodrow Wilson urged neutrality, declaring that America should remain impartial in thought as well as action. But neutrality was difficult in a world at war. The conflict in Europe was unprecedented in scale and brutality, marked by trench warfare, chemical weapons, and industrial slaughter. The U.S. provided arms and supplies mostly to Britain and France, but tensions with Germany grew. Unrestricted submarine warfare by German U-boats, including the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, shocked Americans. So did the Zimmermann telegram in 1917, in which Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico against the U.S. on April 6, 1917. The United States entered the war, declaring war on Germany. Wilson framed it as a fight to make the world safe for democracy. American mobilization was swift. Over 4 million men joined the armed forces. Women served as nurses and in clerical roles. African Americans, though segregated and often assigned menial duties, also fought bravely, most notably the Harlem Hellfighters of the 369th Infantry. At home, the war transformed society. The Selective Service Act drafted soldiers. The economy was reorganized for war production. The War Industries Board, Food Administration, and Committee on Public Information coordinated industry, rationing, and propaganda. But civil liberties suffered. The Espionage Act and Sedition Act criminalized dissent. Socialist Eugene V. Debs was imprisoned for opposing the war. Immigrants and radicals were surveilled. Loyalty was demanded and deviation punished. In 1918, American forces turned the tide of war. At Chateauthierry, Meuse-Argonne, and Belleau Wood, the American Expeditionary Forces, led by General John J. Pershing, helped break German lines. On November 11th, an armistice ended the fighting. Wilson traveled to Versailles to shape the peace. His 14 points outlined a vision of a just and lasting peace, including national self-determination and a League of Nations to prevent future wars. But at home, Wilson faced resistance. The Senate, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. The U.S. never joined the League. Americans were weary of foreign entanglements. Meanwhile, the war's aftermath brought turmoil. The Red Scare saw a crackdown on suspected radicals. Race riots erupted in cities like Chicago. Labor strikes surged. And in 1918 to 1919, a global influenza pandemic killed over 600,000 Americans, more than had died in combat. The war had made America a world power but also left deep scars. As the 1920s approached, the nation stood at a crossroads, caught between global leadership and isolation. Progress and backlash, idealism and realism. The 1920s roared into American life, with energy, excess, and transformation. After the disillusionment of World War I, the United States embraced a new era of prosperity, modernity, and consumerism. It was a decade of jazz and flappers, skyscrapers and speakeasies, yet also one of deep cultural clashes and undercurrents of tension. Economically, the nation surged. Mass production, led by Henry Ford's assembly line, revolutionized industry. Automobiles became affordable, reshaping cities and countryside alike. The consumer economy boomed. Radios, washing machines, and vacuum cleaners entered American homes. Advertising exploded, selling not just products but lifestyles. Wall Street soared. The stock market, fueled by speculation and easy credit, became a national obsession. Millions bought in, believing prosperity was permanent. By now, pay later became the mantra of the age. Culturally, the 1920s were a golden age. The Harlem Renaissance blossomed, in New York an explosion of black creativity and pride. Writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Claude McKay gave voice to African American experience, while jazz legends like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington redefined music. Modernism swept the arts. Writers such as F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and T.S. Eliot challenged tradition and embraced new styles. Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby captured the glamour and hollowness of the era. Women, newly enfranchised by the 19th Amendment, pushed boundaries. Flappers cut their hair short, wore bold fashion, and defied traditional norms. More women entered the workforce and higher education, yet real political and economic equality remained elusive. Prohibition, enacted by the 18th Amendment and enforced by the Volstead Act, banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol. Instead of eliminating drinking, it fueled a black market. Speakeasies, bootleggers, and gangsters like Al Capone turned prohibition into a farce and a violent one. Organized crime flourished. Not all embraced the new era. Rural Americans, religious fundamentalists, and traditionalists pushed back. The Scopes trial, in which a Tennessee teacher was prosecuted for teaching evolution, became a national spectacle pitting science against scripture, modernity against tradition. The Immigration Act of 1924 severely restricted immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe and barred Asians altogether. America's gates narrowed as its cities expanded. By the decade's end, the prosperity seemed limitless. But beneath the surface lay dangers, speculative bubbles, wage inequality, weak banking structures. On October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. The party was over. The Roaring Twenties ended, not with a whisper, but with a thunderous fall into economic despair. The stock market crash of 1929 did not cause the Great Depression alone, but it marked the beginning of the worst economic crisis in American history. Banks failed, factories closed, unemployment soared to over 25%. Breadlines and shantytowns dubbed Hoovervilles spread across the country. For millions, the American dream collapsed overnight. President Herbert Hoover, committed to limited government intervention, urged voluntary cooperation and charity. But as the crisis deepened, public patience wore thin. Farmers lost land. Dust storms ravaged the Great Plains, turning once rich farmland into a barren dust bowl. Migrant Sokas fled west in search of work, often finding only prejudice and poverty. In 1932, Americans voted overwhelmingly for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who promised a New Deal for the American people. Charismatic, confident, and crippled by polio, FDR projected hope and action. In his first 100 days, he launched a whirlwind of legislation aimed at relief, recovery, and reform. Banks were stabilized through the Emergency Banking Act and FDIC insurance. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work restoring forests and building parks. The Public Works Administration and Works Progress Administration created roads, bridges, and schools. Artists, writers, and musicians were employed under federal programs, capturing the spirit of the age. Social Security Act of 1935 created pensions for the elderly and safety nets for the unemployed. The National Labor Relations Act empowered workers to unionize and bargain collectively. The Securities and Exchange Commission regulated the stock market to prevent future crashes. Roosevelt's New Deal was revolutionary. It redefined the role of the federal government in American life, expanding its presence in homes, workplaces, and markets. Supporters hailed it as salvation. Critics called it socialism. The Supreme Court initially resisted, striking down key programs. FDR, frustrated, proposed his controversial court-packing plan to add justices more favorable to his policies.
Ow.
Though the plan failed, the court shifted its stance. New Deal laws began to stand. Not all were lifted equally. African Americans and women benefited less, often excluded from programs or segregated. Yet many found new political voices, joining labor movements and reshaping the Democratic coalition. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt emerged as a tireless advocate for the poor, for racial justice, and for human rights. By the late 1930s, the New Deal had not ended the Depression, but it had restored hope. The economy improved, but unemployment remained high. FDR won re-election in 1936 by a landslide, yet dark clouds were forming overseas. Europe teetered toward war. Fascism was on the rise. America, still recovering, would soon face a choice: remain isolated or engage with the world once again. The 1930s had seen America retreat inward, wary after World War I, and preoccupied with economic survival. But the tide of history would not be denied. In Europe, Hitler's Nazi regime rearmed Germany and invaded its neighbors. In Asia, Japan pursued imperial conquest, invading Manchuria in 1931 and China in 1937. The world drifted into war, and by 1939, it ignited. The United States initially remained neutral. Public opinion shifted as Nazi Germany overran France, bombed Britain, and enacted genocidal policies against Jews and others. Roosevelt, in his third term, pushed the Lend-Lease Act, supplying arms to Britain and later the Soviet Union. He warned of becoming the arsenal of democracy. Then came December 7, 1941. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, killing over 2,400 Americans and crippling the Pacific Fleet. The next day, the U.S. declared war on Japan. Shortly after, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. The world was now fully engulfed in World War II. America mobilized like never before. Over 16 million Americans served in uniform. Factories retooled overnight to produce tanks, planes, and ships. Women entered the workforce in droves, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. War bonds, rationing, and victory gardens became part of everyday life. African Americans, though still facing segregation, also contributed mightily. The Double V campaign sought victory over fascism abroad and racism at home. The Tuskegee Airmen, an all-black fighter group, earned distinction. Native Americans served as code talkers, using indigenous languages to transmit unbreakable battlefield messages. The U.S. fought on two fronts. In Europe, American troops landed in North Africa in 1942, then invaded Italy in 1943. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. Within a year, Paris was liberated and Germany was collapsing. Adolf Hitler committed suicide in April 1945. Germany surrendered on May 8, VE Day. In the Pacific, the war was brutal. Battles at Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa were hard-fought and deadly. As U.S. forces approached the Japanese mainland, estimates of casualties for a full invasion soared into the millions. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the first and only use of nuclear weapons in war. Japan surrendered shortly after, on August 15th VJ Day. World War II had reshaped the world. Over 400,000 Americans had died. The U.S. emerged as a global superpower rivaled only by the Soviet Union. The United Nations was born with American support. But so too was a new fear of nuclear annihilation and of a Cold War already taking shape. With World War II over, The United States stood at the pinnacle of global power. Its economy was booming, its military unmatched, its industries unscathed by the destruction that had ravaged Europe and Asia. Yet peace brought not relief but new anxieties. The Soviet Union, once an ally, was now a rival. Led by Joseph Stalin, the USSR established communist regimes across Eastern Europe, forming the Iron Curtain. In response, the U.S. adopted a policy of containment, at halting the spread of communism worldwide. President Harry S. Truman introduced the Truman Doctrine in 1947, pledging support to nations resisting communist influence. That same year, the Marshall Plan committed billions to rebuild Western Europe, both humanitarian aid and strategic investment. In 1949, the U.S. joined its first peacetime military alliance, NATO. The Cold War wasn't always hot, but it was deadly serious. In 1948, the Berlin blockade saw the Soviets cut off West Berlin. The U.S. responded with the Berlin airlift, supplying the city by air for nearly a year. The message was clear. America would stand firm. At home, fears of communism erupted into paranoia. The House Un-American Activities Committee investigated alleged communist influence in Hollywood and labor unions. Senator Joseph McCarthy exploited these fears, launching witch hunts that ruined lives with little evidence. McCarthyism became a byword for reckless accusations and political repression. The post-war period also brought profound change to daily life. The GI Bill helped millions of veterans attend college, buy homes, and join the middle class. Suburbia exploded, with developments like Levittown offering affordable housing to white families, often excluding people of color. Television, once rare, became a fixture in American homes. Consumerism, fast food, and pop culture reshaped the landscape. Rock and roll, led by Elvis Presley, shocked older generations and energized the youth, yet beneath prosperity, tensions brewed. African Americans, returning veterans among them, demanded equality. Jackie Robinson broke baseball's color barrier in 1947. President Truman desegregated the armed forces in 1948. But Jim Crow endured. The seeds of the civil rights movement were growing. In 1950, the Cold War turned violent in Korea when North Korean troops invaded the South. The U.S., under the banner of the United Nations, intervened. A brutal seesaw conflict followed. After Chinese forces entered the war, the front stabilized near the 38th parallel. An armistice was signed in 1953, but no peace treaty leaving Korea divided to this day. The Cold War had hardened. Nuclear weapons, ideological struggle, and geopolitical chess defined the age. The United States was now a global leader, whether it wanted to be or not. As the 1960s dawned, the United States stood at a crossroads. On the surface, it was a prosperous superpower, dynamic, modern, and wealthy. But underneath, the demands for justice, equality, and transformation grew louder. The next decade would be one of profound reckoning. In 1960, John F. Kennedy, a young senator from Massachusetts, was elected president. Charismatic and eloquent, Kennedy embodied a new generation of leadership, promised a new frontier, inspiring Americans to reach for both scientific and moral progress. The space race intensified. In 1961, the Soviet Union put the first man in space. Kennedy pledged to land a man on the moon before the decade's end. But the real frontiers were at home. The civil rights movement, long simmering, now exploded into national consciousness. In 1960, black students launched sit-ins at segregated lunch counters in Greensboro, North Carolina. The Freedom Riders of 1961 challenged segregated interstate travel. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. led massive demonstrations in Birmingham, facing fire hoses and police dogs. That August, he delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington, calling the nation to fulfill its founding promises. Kennedy proposed a civil rights bill, but did not live to see it passed. On November 22, 1963, he was assassinated in Dallas. The nation mourned, stunned and shaken. Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy's vice president, took the helm and pushed through sweeping legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation in public places. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 struck down barriers to black suffrage. Johnson declared a war on poverty and launched the Great Society, expanding education, healthcare, and environmental protections. But social unrest deepened. Urban riots erupted. Detroit, born of frustration over systemic racism and poverty. The rise of Black Power, led by figures like Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party, challenged the nonviolent strategy of the mainstream movement. Meanwhile, the Vietnam War escalated. Johnson sent hundreds of thousands of troops into a murky, unwinnable conflict. Televised images of jungle warfare and body bags fueled outrage. The Tet Offensive exposed the war's grim reality. Protests swept college campuses. Muhammad Ali refused the draft. Kent State students were shot by the National Guard. 1968 was a year of trauma. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April. Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother and presidential hopeful, was killed in June. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago descended into chaos. By the early 1970s, a new wave of activism surged. The women's liberation movement, led by voices like Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan, challenged gender inequality. The Stonewall riots sparked the modern LGBTQ rights movement. Environmentalism rose after the first Earth Day in 1970. The American Indian movement and Chicano rights activists demanded justice. In 1972, the U.S. pulled back from Vietnam. In 1973, the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court ruling legalized abortion. Social revolutions were reshaping the nation, yet trust in government was crumbling. The final blow would come with Watergate, a political scandal that would shake the foundations of American democracy. The unraveling began with a break-in. On June 17, 1972, 5 men were caught inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. What seemed like a minor burglary soon snowballed into a full-blown political scandal. Investigations revealed that members of President Richard Nixon's re-election committee had orchestrated the break-in and that the White House had attempted a cover-up. As journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post pursued the story, congressional hearings uncovered a system of corruption, surveillance, and abuse of power. Tapes of Nixon's conversations, once revealed, confirmed his involvement. Facing near-certain impeachment, Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974, the only U.S. president to do so. Gerald Ford, his vice president, assumed the presidency and promptly pardoned Nixon, sparking national controversy. Watergate left deep scars. Its public trust in government plummeted. The myth of American exceptionalism was shaken not by foreign enemies, but by internal rot. Meanwhile, the economy faltered. The U.S. faced stagflation, a combination of high inflation, high unemployment, and stagnant growth. The 1973 oil crisis, triggered by an embargo from OPEC in response to U.S. support for Israel, caused gas shortages and long lines at pumps. The post-war boom was over. American industries struggled to compete globally. Manufacturing jobs declined. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Buffalo faced economic collapse. The Sun Belt grew as northern states deindustrialized, shifting political and economic power south and west. Culturally, the 1970s were marked by cynicism and experimentation. Hollywood gave us anti-heroes in Taxi Driver and The Godfather. Music turned inward. The raw honesty of punk, the soul of Motown, the rise of disco. Technology began to stir. In a California garage, Apple was founded in 1976. In foreign policy, Ford and later Jimmy Carter struggled with a shifting world. The Vietnam War ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. American defeat was complete and humiliating. The Cold War continued, but the easing of tensions with the Soviet Union lost momentum. Revolution in Iran overthrew the U.S.-backed Shah. Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 Americans hostage for 444 days. The Iran hostage crisis, broadcast nightly, devastated Carter's presidency and symbolized America's waning influence abroad. In July 1979, Carter delivered a somber speech about a crisis of confidence. He spoke the truth, but Americans didn't want honesty. They wanted optimism. They wanted a new morning. In 1980, they would elect a former actor to deliver it. The 1980s ushered in a new political era in America, one defined by conservatism, deregulation, and a reinvigorated sense of national purpose. At its center stood Ronald Reagan, former actor, governor of California, and charismatic communicator. Elected in a landslide over Jimmy Carter, Reagan promised a rebirth of American greatness. He called it Morning in America. Reagan's philosophy was clear: smaller government, lower taxes, and a strong military. His economic plan, dubbed Reaganomics, cut income taxes significantly, reduced government spending on social programs, and loosened regulations. Supporters credited him with restoring confidence and jump-starting growth. Critics argued the benefits flowed mainly to the wealthy, and that cuts to welfare programs deepened poverty. Still, the economy rebounded. Inflation fell. Wall Street boomed. Consumerism surged. Yuppie culture, MTV, and the rise of personal computers marked a fast-paced, image-driven decade. Reagan also led a renewed Cold War offensive. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire and dramatically increased defense spending, including development of the Strategic Defense Initiative. But even as rhetoric escalated, diplomacy advanced. Mikhail Gorbachev, leader of the USSR from 1985, introduced reforms, glasnost, and perestroika. Reagan and Gorbachev met in historic summits. In 1987, Reagan stood in Berlin and famously declared, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." At home, Reagan survived an assassination attempt, reshaped the judiciary with conservative appointments, and weathered scandals, most notably the Iran-Contra affair, in which weapons were secretly sold to Iran and profits diverted to anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua. In 1988, George H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice president, was elected. His presidency witnessed a world transformed. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and by 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War, after nearly half a century, was over. But peace was not absolute. In 1990, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait. The U.S. led a global coalition in Operation Desert Storm, a swift and decisive military victory that pushed Iraqi forces out. The Gulf War demonstrated America's unmatched military power. The 1990s, under President Bill Clinton, were marked by economic prosperity, globalization, and cultural shifts. The Internet revolution began. NAFTA linked U.S. trade with Canada and Mexico. Crime fell. Unemployment dropped. Clinton, a centrist Democrat, blended liberal and conservative policies embracing welfare reform, deficit reduction, and toughened crime legislation. Yet scandal dogged his presidency. Its affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky led to impeachment by the House of Representatives in 1998. Clinton was acquitted by the Senate and completed his term with high approval ratings. As the millennium approached, Americans enjoyed relative peace and economic success. The dot-com boom fueled optimism. Multiculturalism grew. But underneath, new threats stirred. Terrorist attacks abroad in Africa, the Middle East, and on U.S. embassies warned of a gathering storm. The 2000 presidential election between George W. Bush and Al Gore ended in controversy and confusion. Decided by a razor-thin margin in Florida and a Supreme Court ruling, Bush took office in January 2001. 8 months later, everything would change. From the Ice Age migrations of Paleo-Indians to the dawn of the 21st century, the history of the United States of America is a story of extraordinary complexity, one marked by contradiction, resilience, and reinvention. It began with ancient civilizations, Cahokia, the ancestral Pueblones, the Iroquois who thrived on the continent long before European ships crossed the Atlantic. Their sophisticated societies laid the first human foundations on this land. Then came colonization, Spanish missions, French fur trappers, British settlements. The collision of cultures brought trade, war, and ultimately the birth of a new, rebellious idea. In 1776, the colonies declared their independence, not just from Britain, but from tyranny itself. The American Revolution unleashed the ideals of liberty and equality into the modern world. Even as those same ideals were denied to women, Native Americans, and enslaved people, the nation born in Philadelphia would spend centuries wrestling with the meaning of its founding words. The early republic forged a constitution that endures, weathering wars and crises. From Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase to the industrial expansion of the 19th century, America grew sprawling westward, conquering territories, displacing peoples. It was a land of opportunity for some, and oppression for others. The Civil War tore the nation apart over slavery and union. It cost over 600,000 lives, but preserved the United States and ended chattel slavery. Reconstruction attempted a new birth of freedom, but was betrayed and replaced with Jim Crow laws. Delaying justice for nearly a century, the Gilded Age brought towering fortunes and dire poverty. The Progressive Era fought back with reform. America rose as a global power through the Spanish-American War, then shouldered the burdens of the 20th century, World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. In defeating fascism, the U.S. emerged as a superpower, but also a symbol of contradiction. The Cold War demanded strength abroad and security at home, while the Civil Rights Movement demanded justice within. The 1960s brought moonshots and marches, assassinations and awakenings. Vietnam tested the limits of power. Watergate tested the limits of trust. Yet America endured, reshaped by every struggle. Immigration and innovation transformed the social fabric. The rise of feminism, environmentalism, LGBTQ rights, and labor movements expanded the meaning of we the people. Reagan's conservatism, Clinton's centrism, and the end of the Cold War gave Americans a sense of triumph at century's end. But deeper currents flowed: globalization, inequality, racial tension, cultural division, and the brewing storm of terrorism. By 2001, the United States stood on the edge of a new millennium, still a beacon, still burdened by its past. This journey across 25 chapters and hundreds of years reveals not a perfect nation, but a restless one. A republic constantly in motion, constantly striving, constantly redefining freedom. For in the end, the story of America is not written only by presidents or generals, but by workers and dreamers, by immigrants and outcasts, by enslaved people and abolitionists, by artists, rebels, reformers, and everyday citizens. It is a story of struggle and of hope. It is a nation that has stumbled, risen, and reached imperfect, yet determined. As its motto says, E pluribus onomot of many, one, and its story is far from over.